The year 2008 began with a heavy sense of finality that I can still feel in my bones today. I remember the day of my university graduation in Cheongju with a clarity that time hasn't been able to dim. The air was crisp, almost sharp, and the pale winter sun was reflecting off the tall glass windows of the campus buildings I had walked past for 4 long years. As I stood there in my heavy black graduation gown, adjusting the stiff silk tassel on my mortarboard, I felt a strange, suffocating mix of liberation and terrifying uncertainty. Everyone around me was laughing, throwing their caps into the sky, and talking loudly about their new lives, stable jobs at banks, corporate offices in Seoul, or logistics firms. But as I watched those caps fall back to earth, I felt a hollow space opening up in my chest. To me, that diploma wasn't just a certificate of completion. It was a ticking clock. I made a choice then that surprised my professors and worried my parents. I decided to take a gap year. I wasn't running away from the mandatory military service that hangs over every Korean man. I was running towards a version of myself I hadn't met yet. I wanted 365 days of absolute, unfiltered reality before the iron gates of a garrison claimed 2 years of my youth. That gap year became my true education, far more than any textbook had ever provided. I took on jobs that left my hands calloused and my spirit weary. I remember working in the stifling humidity of a warehouse, moving heavy boxes until my vision blurred, and the only thing I could hear was the rhythmic, mindless hum of the conveyor belt. I sat on the bus late at night, surrounded by exhausted laborers whose faces were etched with the silent struggle of the working class. I worked in convenience stores during the graveyard shift, watching the world pass by in a blur of neon lights and tired faces. These experiences weren't just about the money, they were about grit. I started to save every single one, dreaming of a future I couldn't yet see, perhaps a powerful PC, worth 1.2 million KRW that could finally handle the digital worlds I longed to explore. I wanted a machine that could match the speed of my thoughts, a tool that would eventually allow me to tell stories to the world. But as the months of 2008 bled into 2009, the looming shadow of my enlistment notice grew darker with every passing sunset. Most of my friends were searching for comfortable units, administrative desks, or supply depots near the safety of the city. But the more I heard them talk about comfort, the more I craved a challenge that would break me and rebuild me from the ground up. One late night, the blue light of my monitor flickering in my dark room, I found the recruitment page for the 15th Infantry Division. My eyes locked onto the words Reconnaissance Battalion, KO1. People in the online forums called it the land of no return. They spoke of mountain peaks that pierced the clouds and winters so brutal they could freeze the very blood in your veins. They warned of the psychological toll of being the eyes and ears of the nation, standing right on the jagged edge of the DMZ. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. I didn't want a desk, I wanted to be forged in the coldest fire. I moved the cursor, my hand, trembling slightly, and clicked the volunteer button. In that single digital second, my fate was sealed. I was no longer a civilian dreaming of a future. I was a volunteer for the most feared unit on the border. I was headed to the jagged, frozen edge of the world. The last few weeks at home were a blur of bittersweet goodbyes and unspoken fears. My mother's cooking suddenly tasted more precious, and my father's silence grew even deeper, filled with a pride he couldn't quite vocalize. The transition from civilian to soldier officially began in a small, dusty barbershop near the train station. There was no music, only the loud, aggressive buzz of the mechanical clippers. I watched in the mirror as my hair, the last remnant of my individual identity, fell to the cold floor in thick, black clumps. Each pass of the blade felt like it was shaving away a part of my soul, my history and my dreams. When it was finished, the person staring back at me was a stranger, a pale, raw-looking recruit with a 5-digit number instead of a name. I touched my head, feeling the cold air on my skin for the first time. and realized that the person I was yesterday was officially dead. The bus ride to the training center was a journey into a collective, heavy silence. Dozens of us sat there, our baseball caps pulled low to hide our shame, and our fear staring out at the passing trees, as the familiar city skyline was slowly replaced by the jagged, imposing mountains of Gangwon Province. The air turned colder as we headed north, the lush greens of the south fading into the harsh gray stone of the Gyeongwon Mountains. The first week of boot camp was a psychological earthquake. The air was filled with the sharp metallic scent of gun oil and the constant rhythmic shouting of drill instructors that seemed to echo from every corner of the compound. We were taught to move in perfect unison, to eat our meals in mere minutes, and to silence the voices in our own heads. My combat boots felt like iron weights, and the dust from the parched training ground coated my throat until every breath tasted like grit. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest as we were forced to crawl through the dirt and sprint until our lungs burned. The nights were the hardest part of the ordeal. In the suffocating darkness of the barracks, the silence was broken only by the sound of muffled sobbing. Men who had been shouting cadences with pride during the day were now weeping into their thin pillows, longing for the touch of a mother's hand or the simple, forgotten warmth of a home-cooked meal. I lay there staring at the cold underside of the bunk above me, wondering if I had made the greatest mistake of my life. My mind would wander back to the university campus in Cheongju, to the simple joy of a cup of coffee, and to the freedom I had so casually discarded for a life of mud and discipline. But deep down, amidst the fear and the exhaustion, a new kind of strength was beginning to take root. I was being deconstructed, layer by layer, until only the core of my character remained. I was no longer a student or a part-time worker. I was a recruit of the 15th Division, preparing to face the Tiger. The journey had only just begun, and the real test, the frozen mountains of Cheorwan, was waiting for me just beyond the horizon. The iron gates of the 15th Division Training Center didn't just close behind us. They felt like the heavy metallic jaws of a giant beast, sealing off the world we once knew forever. The first 48 hours were a psychological earthquake, a systematic deconstruction of everything we thought we were as human beings. We were no longer university graduates from Cheongju, part-time workers, or beloved sons with bright futures. We were silhouettes in green, identified only by the cold black numbers pinned to our chests. The air in the barracks was thick and suffocating, smelling of floor wax, industrial starch, and the heavy metallic tang of shared anxiety that hung in the air like a fog. Every single movement was dictated by the sharp, rhythmic blast of a whistle that seemed to vibrate inside our very skulls, even when it was silent. We learned to fold our blankets with the geometric precision of a surgeon, to eat our meals in a silence so absolute you could hear the frantic heartbeat of the man sitting next to you, and to stand at attention until our shadows felt heavier than our own exhausted, aching bodies. The physical deconstruction began with the rising of the sun over the jagged, unforgiving peaks of Gangwon Province. At exactly 0600, the bugle would tear through the thin, precious veil of sleep like a jagged blade. Within seconds, we were on the frozen parade ground, our breath blooming in the cold morning air like small, dissipating ghosts of the people we used to be. Then came the training that every soldier in the world, from the sands of the Middle East to the mountains of Korea, remembers in their deepest, darkest nightmares the chemical, biological, and radiological CBR chamber. I remember standing in that long, silent line, the heavy rubber gas mask pressing against my face, my own frantic breath echoing inside the mask like a trapped animal. When the heavy steel door finally opened and the CS gas hit the air, time didn't just slow down, it stopped entirely. It wasn't just a sting, it was an all-consuming fire in the lungs. A desperate, primal struggle for a single clean breath that simply didn't exist in that space. We stood there, locked in that cramped gray room, our eyes burning with a liquid fire and our throats raw and bleeding, forced to sing military cadences at the top of our lungs to prove we were still breathing. In that moment of pure, blinding agony, the petty worries of my university life in 2008, the exams, the social status, the dreams of a high-end 1.2 million KRW PC all vanished into the acrid smoke. There was only the present, only the pain, and only the trembling hand of my comrade on my shoulder, keeping me from falling to the cold floor. We emerged from that chamber as different men. The civilian skin had been burned away, leaving only the raw, exposed grit of a soldier of the 15th Division. But the true test of endurance wasn't the gas or the endless sprints in the mud. It was the psychological hunger for a connection to the world that still loved us and saw us as individuals. In the military, your senses become hyper-aware, starved for the smallest joys that you once ignored. This led to the legendary Choco Pie Sunday. I remember the surreal, heavy silence of the base chapel, a sanctuary of wood and shadow amidst the harsh concrete of the camp. We sat there, hundreds of young men with shaved heads and bruised spirits, waiting for the only miracle that mattered in that world. When the small plastic-wrapped cake finally touched my palm, it felt like a holy relic, more valuable than any gold or treasure on the outside. I didn't eat it immediately. I sat there in the dim light, feeling the soft texture of the marshmallow through the wrapper, smelling the cheap, waxy chocolate that managed to seep through the plastic. It was a bridge to my mother's kitchen, to the graduation party I had so recently enjoyed in Cheongju, and to the freedom I had sacrificed for this duty. When I finally took that first bite, the sweetness was so intense, so impossibly rich, that it brought tears to my eyes. I wasn't just tasting sugar and flour, I was tasting my own fading humanity. Around me, I saw tough, hardened recruits, men who had survived the gas chamber and the bayonet drills without a flinch, weeping silently over a small, round snack. It was the most honest, raw moment of my entire life. Then came the PRI preliminary rifle instruction. We spent days lying on the cold, hard earth, our elbows bleeding and our shoulders bruised from the repetitive recoil of empty rifles. Point, aim, breath, fire, the instructors would scream until the words became a mantra that played in our sleep. We learned to treat our rifles not as weapons, but as extensions of our own bodies, as our only companions in the dark. We cleaned them with a devotion that bordered on religious, ensuring not a single speck of dust remained on the bolt. Because in the reconnaissance battalion of KOR-1, your rifle is the only thing that stands between you and the eternal silence of the border. The final trial of boot camp was the 20-kilometer night march. We strapped on our full combat loads, nearly 20 kilograms of gear that dug into our shoulders like the weight of the mountains themselves. As we marched into the absolute darkness of the Gangwon forests, the only sound was the rhythmic clack-clack of our gear and the heavy, synchronized thud of boots on gravel. My feet were covered in blisters that felt like hot coals, and every step was a psychological battle against the overwhelming urge to simply collapse into the ditch and stay there forever. I looked up at the stars, the same stars I had watched from the quiet campus in Cheongju, and realized they looked fundamentally different from here. They looked colder, sharper, more distant, as if they were judging the men we were becoming in the dark. But as we reached the summit of the final ridge and saw the first light of dawn breaking over the jagged peaks of KOR-1, a surge of pride unlike anything I had ever known filled my chest. The pain in my feet vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I had survived. I had been forged in the fire of the 15th Division. I looked at my comrades, their faces covered in a mask of dust and sweat, their eyes reflecting the same hard-won resilience. We were no longer recruits, we were soldiers, ready to move toward the jagged edge of the DMZ. The transition was complete. My civilian life was a closed book, and a new, more dangerous chapter was about to begin in the frozen valleys of the reconnaissance battalion. I was ready to become a ghost of the mountains, a silent guardian of the border, and a man who knew exactly what he was willing to fight for. The forge had done its work, and the tiger was finally awake, staring north into the cold, dark unknown of the border. The transition from the training center to the 15th Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Battalion in KOR-1 was not just a change in location. It was a descent into a different world entirely. As the military truck wound its way up the jagged, unforgiving mountain roads of Gangwon Province, the air outside changed. It became thin, biting, and filled with a silence that felt heavy with history. KOR-1 is a place where the mountains seem to touch the sky, and the wind never stops whispering of a war that never truly ended. This was the land of the tiger, a region where the terrain itself is a weapon. As the truck climbed higher, the lush greens of the south were replaced by a landscape of brutal gray stone and frozen earth. This was the DMZ, the most heavily fortified border on the planet, and I was now one of its silent guardians. The shift was a psychological shock. In the reconnaissance battalion, we weren't just soldiers, we were specialists, the eyes and ears of a nation frozen in a state of eternal vigilance. The training here was designed to break the last remnants of our civilian spirits and rebuild us as predators of the mountains. But no amount of training could prepare me for the first time I stood before the southern limit line gate. I can still hear the rhythmic metallic groan of that massive iron gate, opening a sound that signaled our departure from the world of safety and our entry into the no man's land. Crossing that line wasn't just a physical act, it was stepping into a graveyard of the past and a potential battlefield of the future. The moment that gate locked behind us with a heavy, final thud, the air seemed to grow even colder, and the silence became deafening. Inside the DMZ, the world feels fundamentally different. Nature has reclaimed the land in a way that is both hauntingly beautiful and deeply terrifying. The grass grows tall and wild, hiding the scars of old trenches and the remnants of a war that remains on pause. Every step we took was a calculated risk, a dance with destiny. The ground beneath our combat boots wasn't just earth, it was a complex map of hidden, lethal dangers. KOR-1 is infamous for its ghost mines, landmines shifted by decades of mountain floods and landslides, waiting for a single, misplaced footstep to end a life in a flash of fire and steel. We moved in a single, silent file, following the exact footsteps of the man in front of us with a religious devotion. A deviation of just a few inches could mean the difference between coming home and becoming part of the mountain. The primary mission was the search and ambush operations. We would move through the dense, frozen underbrush with the silent grace of ghosts, our eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines for any sign of movement. The most chilling moments occurred when we stood on the precipice of a ridge and looked across the valley through our binoculars. There, standing like silent sentinels, were the North Korean Guard Post's GPs. Through the lens, I could see the pale flickers of their lights, and sometimes the silhouettes of their soldiers watching us with the same desperate intensity. It was an eye-to-eye confrontation with the unknown. A psychological tug-of-war where the only thing separating us was a few hundred meters of mountain air and a razor-wire fence. The realization that they were likely just as cold, just as hungry, and just as tense as we were didn't make the situation any less terrifying. It only added a layer of tragic humanity to the impending threat. But the true constant enemy in KOR-1 was the climate. When the northern winter hit, the world didn't just turn cold. It turned into a vast, silent, and lethal icebox. The temperature would plummet to negative 30 degrees Celsius, a level of cold that is impossible to describe to anyone who hasn't felt their own breath freeze instantly. It was a physical assault on your very existence. The wind felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing through layers of winter gear, searching for even a millimeter of exposed skin to bite and scar. During our 12-hour ambush vigils, we had to lie perfectly still in the snow, becoming statues of ice. My fingers would go from stinging to a white-hot burning sensation, and finally to a hollow, terrifying numbness. I remember looking at the man lying inches from me, his eyelashes frosted with thick white ice, his eyes staring blankly into the dark void. In those frozen nights, the university degree I had worked so hard for in Cheongju, and the social life I had enjoyed felt like they belonged to a dream of another person in another lifetime. The 1.2 million KRWPC I had dreamed of building seemed like a relic from a forgotten civilization. The only thing that mattered was the survival of the pack. We shared body heat, our limited frozen rations, and the silent, terrifying weight of the mission. We were suffering together, and in that shared agony, a bond was forged that was stronger than any friendship I had ever known. I learned the true meaning of human endurance in those valleys. I discovered the 40% rule, that when your brain is screaming at you that you are finished, that you cannot take one more step in the sub-zero wind, you are actually only at 40% of your true capacity. This realization didn't just help me survive the DMZ, it became the steel foundation of my entire life. The forge of Kaorwan was merciless, but it made us unbreakable sentinels. We stood our ground when the world was asleep, enduring the impossible so that the families behind the iron gates could live in a peace they might never fully understand. The transition into the DMZ was never something you could truly get used to. It didn't matter how many times you had stood before the southern limit line gate every single time. Those massive iron hinges groaned open. Your heart would drop into your stomach. This was the dead zone, a strip of land where the laws of the modern world were suspended, replaced by the primitive rules of survival and the cold, unblinking eyes of the North. Crossing that threshold meant leaving the safety of the 15th Division's garrison behind, and stepping into a world that felt as though it were perpetually holding its breath, waiting for a single mistake to ignite a disaster. The first thing you learn in the DMZ is that the ground is not your friend. It is a graveyard of hidden, lethal history. Kaorwan is infamous for its minefields, but these aren't the neatly mapped minefields you see in textbooks. These are the ghost mines, tens of thousands of landmines shifted by decades of mountain floods, landslides, and the relentless pressure of nature. On rainy days, the DMZ took on a particularly haunting atmosphere. The sound of the rain hitting your helmet would be the only thing you heard, until a sudden, deep boom would echo through the valleys. It was the sound of the earth shifting, of a landslide triggering a mine in some forgotten ravine. Those explosions, occurring without a single person nearby, were a constant reminder that the very ground beneath your feet was alive with the intent to kill. Every time the rain stopped, we knew the map had changed. The safe paths we had memorized might now be hiding a lethal trap that had drifted in the mud. Because of this constant threat, our search operations were conducted with a level of discipline that bordered on the religious. We moved in a single, rigid file. Every man was instructed to place his boots exactly where the man in front had stepped. If the point man moved an inch to the left to avoid a rock, the entire squad moved an inch to the left. You lived and died by the heels of the man in front of you. Your K2 rifle was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was an extension of your body, its cold metal weight a constant grounding presence. The safety was always off in your mind, even if it was on the weapon. Your eyes were never still, constantly scanning the tall grass, the ridgelines and the shadows of the old, twisted trees that had grown undisturbed for 60 years. But the DMZ wasn't just a place of machines and mines, it was a place of human tragedy. During our long ambush vigils, which could last for 12 agonizing hours in the sub-zero cold, we would sit in total silence, our night vision goggles turning the world into a ghostly shade of green. From our concealed positions, we would often observe the North Korean guard posts, GPs, and the soldiers stationed there. The reality was far more complex than the propaganda we were fed. In the depths of winter, when the food supplies in the north were at their lowest, we would watch through our binoculars as North Korean soldiers descended from their positions toward the military demarcation line. They weren't moving with the aggression of an invading force, they were moving with the desperation of the hungry. We watched them stoop low in the frozen fields, their thin, worn-out uniforms offering little protection against the K-1 wind. They were foraging. They were digging in the frozen earth for mountain herbs, san namul, or any roots that could provide a semblance of a meal. It was a sight that stayed with you long after the patrol was over. Seeing your enemy, reduced to scavenging for wild greens in a minefield just to survive another night, created a strange, hollow feeling in your chest. It was a confrontation with the tragic humanity of the border, the realization that on both sides of the wire, there were young men suffering in the cold, caught in a cycle of history that felt larger than all of us combined. Yet, that empathy never allowed us to lower our guard. The tension was always there, a sharp metallic taste in the back of your throat. A North Korean soldier foraging for herbs could become a combatant in a split second if a superior appeared or if a misunderstanding occurred. We lived in that gray area, the space between pity and lethality. Every mission was a lesson in the fragility of peace. We stood our ground in the tall grass, our fingers numbing on the triggers, watching the shadows move across the valley. We were the silent witnesses to a war that was never truly over, standing in a landscape where the rain triggered mines and the winter turned soldiers into scavengers. We were the tigers of the border, but in the DMZ, we were also the guardians of a heavy, frozen silence that the rest of the world had long ago chosen to forget. The year 2010 did not just begin with the usual freezing winds of Cheorwan. It began with a heavy, ominous silence that seemed to coat the entire 15th Division like a layer of thick ice. For those of us in the reconnaissance battalion, we were already accustomed to high tension, but something in the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. We were the eyes of the nation, standing on the jagged edge of the DMZ, and we could feel the geopolitical tectonic plates shifting beneath our combat boots long before the rest of the world realized the danger. This was the year that would test the very limits of our sanity, our endurance, and our resolve. It was the year that transformed our military service from a duty into a desperate struggle for survival in the shadow of an impending war. The first blow came in March with the sinking of the ROK's Cheonan. I remember the exact moment the news reached our barracks. The air didn't just turn cold, it turned ironclad. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the men as we watched the flickering television screens in the day room. We saw the wreckage of the ship, the grief of the families, and the cold reality of the maritime border. But for us in Cheorwan, the ocean felt secondary to the land border we were guarding. We knew that if things escalated, the first place the fire would spread was right where we stood. Immediately, the DEFCON status changed. Our lives were no longer measured by the days remaining until discharge, but by the minutes of standby time. Every single piece of equipment we owned, our K2 rifles, our ammunition magazines, our gas masks, and our full combat loads became permanent fixtures of our bodies. We slept in our uniforms, our boots laced tight, ready to spring into action at the sound of a whistle. Every vacation, every leave, and every weekend pass was summarily canceled. The connection to the world outside the university campus in Cheongju, the quiet cafes and the dreams of a creative future was severed by a single administrative order. We were trapped in a cycle of endless full readiness drills. We spent weeks in the trenches and the guard posts, our eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, scanning the North Korean ridge lines with a level of intensity that bordered on madness. The physical exhaustion was immense, but the psychological toll was even greater. We were young men in our early 20s, living with the daily realization that the peace we had taken for granted was as fragile as a sheet of thin ice over a deep, dark abyss. But the true breaking point arrived on a cold November afternoon with the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island. I can still hear the sirens, not the drill sirens we were used to, but the real, piercing, soul-shattering wail of a national emergency. It was a sound that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. For the first time in our lives, we weren't just practicing for war. We were watching it happen in real time on our own soil. The order came down instantly. "To the bunkers! This is not a drill! I repeat, this is not a drill!" We sprinted through the garrison, the weight of our gear crashing against our backs, and descended into the cold, damp, concrete belly of the earth. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was unlike anything I have ever experienced. Imagine 60 men, fully armed and armored, crammed into a space with no windows and only the dim, flickering glow of emergency lights. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of static electricity, gun oil, and the cold, acrid sweat of men who were staring at the end of their lives. We sat there in a silence so deep you could hear the frantic ticking of 100 watches. Every time the radio in the corner crackled with fragmented, terrifying reports from the coast, every man held his breath. We saw the fear in the eyes of our senior sergeants, men who had survived the most brutal winters of KOR-1 without blinking. And that was when the reality truly hit home. It was in that suffocating darkness that our commanding officer performed an act that would be burned into my memory forever. He didn't give a speech about glory or patriotism. He simply handed out small, square sheets of paper and told us to write our final wills. Write what you need to say to your parents, your friends, and those you love, he said, his voice low and steady. Do it now, just in case the sun doesn't rise for us tomorrow. I sat there, leaning against the cold, sweating concrete wall, my rifle resting between my knees like a skeletal companion. I looked at the blank paper, and for a moment, my mind was a total void. How do you summarize 20 years of existence on a scrap of paper in a bunker? I thought of my mother's face when I left for enlistment, and I realized with a stabbing pain that I might never see her smile again. I thought of the 1.2 million KRW PC I had dreamed of building a symbol of a future that now felt like a cruel joke. My hand shook so violently I could barely grip the pen. I wrote to my father, thanking him for the discipline that was currently keeping me from breaking down. I wrote to my mother, begging her not to cry too much, telling her that I was proud to be where I was, even if I was terrified. We folded those papers with trembling fingers and tucked them into our left breast pockets, right over our hearts. We believed in that moment that those papers would be the last things our families ever received from us. We lived in that bunker and in a state of first-stage combat readiness for months following the attack. The winter of 2010 was the coldest on record, but the cold of the weather was nothing compared to the cold of the uncertainty. We conducted search and ambush operations in the DMZ with the knowledge that any moment could be our last. Every time we heard a loud noise, a distant thunderclap, or the shift of a ghost mine in the rain, we instinctively grabbed our weapons, our hearts hammering against the wills in our pockets. We were physically broken, mentally exhausted, and spiritually drained. The military life wasn't just hard anymore. It was an ordeal that reshaped our very souls. We stood our ground on the frozen ridges of KOR-1, watching the dark horizon of the north, standing as the only thing between our families and the fires of war. We were no longer the boys who had graduated in 2008. We were the hardened, weary tigers of the border, survivors of a year that had tried its absolute best to break us. If there is a place on Earth where nature's beauty is a direct curse upon humanity, it is KOR-1 in the dead of winter. As the final months of my service in the 15th Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Battalion approached, the landscape underwent a transformation that was as majestic as it was soul-crushing. To the outside world, to the tourists and the dreamers in the South, the first snowfall is a symbol of romance and purity. But to a soldier stationed on the jagged edge of the DMZ, the sight of a single snowflake is not a blessing. It is a declaration of war. In KO1, winter doesn't just arrive, it occupies the land with an iron fist, turning the world into a vast, silent, and lethal white abyss. We used to say that the winters here were more brutal than those in Siberia or the deepest reaches of Russia. It wasn't an exaggeration born of boredom. It was a fact carved into our frozen skin. The snow in KOR1 doesn't fall in soft, gentle flakes. It falls in relentless, heavy sheets that bury everything in sight within hours. I remember looking out from the guard post at a world that had vanished beneath a meter of white powder. To anyone else, it would have been a postcard-perfect scene, a pristine, untouched wilderness of rolling white hills under a sharp blue sky. But to me, leaning on my cold K2 rifle, that snow was nothing but white trash. It was a heavy, wet, and exhausting burden that we would have to move, inch by agonizing inch, every single day of our lives. The war of the shovels began the moment the first flake touched the ground. In the reconnaissance battalion, our mission was vigilance, but in winter, our mission was survival against the snow. We spent 8, 10, 12 hours a day clearing the paths, the supply roads, and the helipads. I can still hear the rhythmic metallic scrape of 100 shovels against the frozen asphalt, a sound that became the soundtrack to my final winter. Your back feels like it is being broken by a slow-motion weight, your lungs burn with the sub-zero air, and your sweat freezes instantly against your skin. You clear a path, and by the time you reach the end, the beginning is already buried again. It was a Sisyphean labor that stripped away any remaining romantic notions about nature. We didn't see the purity of the snow, we saw the enemy that was trying to bury us alive. Yet, in this frozen hell, there was one strange, paradoxical mercy that only the winter could provide. Our unit, being a specialized reconnaissance battalion stationed so close to the military demarcation line, was isolated from the basic luxuries of the civilian world. We didn't have a PX, no canteen where we could buy snacks, warm food, or cold drinks. We lived on the bare essentials, our days marked by the repetition of duty and the scarcity of comfort. But the winter, for all its cruelty, was the only season that gave us the luxury of a truly cold beverage. I remember the rare occasions when we could get our hands on a few cans of soda or bottled tea from a supply truck. In the sweltering heat of the summer, these drinks were always lukewarm and unsatisfying. But in the winter, the entire world was our refrigerator. We would take those cans and bury them deep in a snowbank outside the barracks. We would leave them there for an hour, the negative 30-degree temperature working its magic. When we pulled them out, the metal was so cold it would almost stick to your skin. And the first sip was an explosion of icy, crisp refreshment that made the back of your throat ache in the best way possible. It was a small, ridiculous joy sitting in a frozen bunker, surrounded by a landscape that wanted to kill us, while enjoying the coldest, most perfect drink of our lives. It was the only time we felt like we were winning against the environment. As I reached the rank of sergeant, I spent my final winter leading the new recruits through this white wasteland. I saw the same look of horror and exhaustion in their eyes that I must have had during my first winter in 2009. I watched them stare at the falling snow with a mix of wonder and despair. I would tell them the same thing my seniors told me: don't look at it as snow. Look at it as the trash of heaven. Pick up your shovel and keep moving. The mountain only lets go of those who don't stop. I realized then that the discipline of the recon unit wasn't just about combat. It was about the mental fortitude to find a reason to smile while shoveling trash in the middle of a sub-zero night. Looking back now from the comfort of my studio, the memories of those Kaorwan winters feel like a fever dream. I can still feel the weight of the shovel and the stinging bite of the wind. But I also remember the taste of that frozen soda and the unbreakable bond I shared with the men who shoveled beside me. We were forged in the ice. We were the soldiers who saw the trash and found the strength to clear a path through it. The beauty of the snow was for the world behind the gates for us. The beauty was in the survival, the endurance, and the quiet pride of knowing that we were the ones standing guard in the coldest corner of the peninsula. The tiger was still awake, even in the deepest white of the Kaorwan winter. If the winter in Kaorwan was a brutal battle against a silent, frozen void, then the summer was a chaotic descent into a humid, suffocating fever dream. There is a common misconception among those who haven't served on the border that once the ice melts, the hardship ends. But in the 15th Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, the changing of the seasons only meant the arrival of a new kind of agony. The same mountains that had tried to freeze our blood in January now turned into a massive, steaming cauldron. The air became thick, heavy with moisture, and smelled of damp earth and rotting vegetation. This was the setting for the most dreaded event in a Korean soldier's calendar, the Yugyok, or guerrilla training. Yugyok is a rite of passage that no soldier in the Republic of Korea Army ever wants to experience twice. It is a week-long ordeal designed to push your physical and mental limits until they shatter. While the world outside was enjoying the summer holidays, we were being marched deep into the jagged mountains of Gangwon Province, carrying our full combat loads under a sun that felt personal in its cruelty. The training began with the PT, the physical training. Imagine hundreds of men in mud-stained fatigues, performing endless repetitions of agonizing exercises on a parched, dusty parade ground. The dust gets into your throat, your eyes, and your lungs, mixing with your sweat to create a layer of grime that feels like a second skin. "Number 8! More energy!" the instructors would scream, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses and red caps, as we held our legs inches above the burning ground until our abdominal muscles vibrated with exhaustion. But the true horror of Yugyok wasn't the physical exercise, it was the conditions of our existence once the sun went down. Because we were training deep in the mountains, we didn't return to the relative comfort of our barracks. We lived in massive olive-drab tents, crammed together like sardines in a tin. Imagine 20 to 30 exhausted, sweat-drenched men, all pushed into a single enclosed space with zero ventilation. The heat inside the tent was a living thing, a heavy blanket of humidity that made it impossible to breathe. Within minutes of entering, the smell would hit you like a physical blow, a thick, nauseating cocktail of old sweat, wet combat boots, dirt, and the raw, unwashed scent of human endurance. It was an odor that didn't just stay in your nose, it seemed to soak into your very soul. We lay there, side by side on thin mats, our shoulders touching, the air so stagnant that every breath felt like inhaling someone else's exhaustion. Sleep, which should have been our only sanctuary, was a luxury we were rarely granted. The mountains of Kaorwan are home to a breed of insects that feel as though they were engineered for biological warfare. The mosquitoes there are not the small, fragile creatures you find in the city. They are massive, aggressive hunters that can bite through the thickest military-issue socks. We called them Ares mosquitoes because of their black and white stripes and their relentless tactical precision. They didn't just buzz, they swarmed. In the absolute darkness of the tent, you could hear the high-pitched whine of thousands of wings circling your head. Because of the suffocating heat, you had to choose between two types of misery: covering yourself entirely with a wool blanket and nearly fainting from heat stroke, or exposing your skin and being systematically devoured by the forest's inhabitants. Most of us spent our nights in a delirious state between waking and sleeping, slapping at our own faces and listening to the rhythmic, exhausted snoring of 20 other men. The mountains also brought a variety of other winged nightmares. Moths as large as birds that would flutter against the tent canvas with a terrifying, heavy thud, and beetles that would crawl over your face in the middle of the night. You woke up every morning feeling more tired than when you lay down, your body covered in itchy, swollen welts, and your mind clouded by a lack of rest. Every muscle ached, every inch of your skin felt filthy, and the cycle would begin all over again at dawn. The heat would rise, the dust would swirl, and the instructors would be waiting with another day of mud and misery. Yet even in this humid hell, the recon mentality remained our only anchor. We laughed at the absurdity of our situation, making jokes about the stench in the tent and the size of the mosquitoes that were carrying us away. We shared our limited water, helped the man who was stumbling during the mountain marches, and found a strange, dark pride in the fact that we could endure what most people couldn't even imagine. The summer in Khaoran taught me that human beings are incredibly resilient. It taught me that you can find a way to survive even when you are suffocating in a tent of 30 men in the middle of a mountain range. As I stood on the final ridge of the training course, looking out over the hazy green valleys of the border, I realized that the heat had forged me just as much as the cold had. I was no longer just a student from Cheongju. I was a soldier who had survived the white trash of winter and the humid rot of summer. I was a survivor of the 15th Division, and I was ready for whatever the world decided to throw at me next. After the white trash of winter had finally melted and the humid, rotting breath of the summer's guerrilla training had passed, there was one event that every soldier in the 15th Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Battalion held in their hearts as a sacred promise. It wasn't a medal, a promotion, or a day of leave. It was the annual Samgyeopsal feast, a rare, singular moment where the ironclad discipline of the border was momentarily softened by the scent of wood smoke and the warmth of brotherhood. In a place like Khaoran, where the environment is a constant adversary, and the threat of war is a silent, permanent resident, this meal was more than just food. It was a ritual of survival and a ceremony of healing. I remember the preparation for that evening with a clarity that still brings a sense of peace to my heart. We would gather in a designated area away from the active patrol zones, setting up makeshift grills on long wooden tables. The first sound that signaled the beginning of the transformation was the sizzle, that rhythmic, high-pitched crackle of thick slabs of pork belly hitting the hot iron plates. In the military, you learn to appreciate the sensory details of life that you once ignored. The smell of the fat rendering, mixing with the sharp aroma of grilled garlic, and the earthy scent of the surrounding forest was like a powerful medicine for our weary spirits. It was a smell that reminded us of home, of the restaurants back in Cheongju, and of the families who were waiting for us beyond the iron gates. As the samgyeopsal turned a perfect golden brown, the green bottles would appear the soju and the makgeolli. These are not just drinks in the Korean tradition, they are the lubricants of the soul. The makgeolli, with its milky, clouded appearance and its slightly sweet, fermented taste, felt like it was washing away the grit of the DMZ from our throats. The soju, sharp and clear, seemed to cauterize the psychological wounds we had carried since the 2010 crisis. We would raise our small glasses in unison, our hands calloused from rifles and shovels, and for a fleeting moment, the hierarchy of rank would fade into the background. We weren't just sergeants and privates, we were survivors who had shared the same frozen bunkers and the same suffocating tents. In those hours of laughter and storytelling, a strange and beautiful thing would happen. The memories that had been agonizing the negative 30-degree nights, the terrifying sound of ghost mines exploding in the rain, and the exhaustion of the night marches began to change. Through the haze of the grill smoke and the warmth of the alcohol, those hardships were reframed as badges of honor. We didn't talk about the fear, we talked about how we overcame it. We didn't talk about the pain. we talked about the bond it had created. This feast was where we processed the trauma of the border, turning the heavy lead of our military service into the gold of a shared legacy. It was the only time we felt that our youth wasn't being wasted, but was being forged into something unbreakable. I remember looking up at the ridgelines of the DMZ while holding my glass of macchioli. The mountains were dark, silent silhouettes against a starlit sky. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of my comrades and the comforting aroma of the food, I felt a deep, desperate wish for peace. I thought to myself, please, just for tonight, let there be no gunshots. Let there be no sirens. Let the silence of the border be the silence of peace, not the silence of tension. I wanted the world to stop for just one night, so that the men I served with could enjoy their meal without their hands instinctively reaching for their K2 rifles. It was a prayer whispered into the K-Or-Wan wind, a hope that the humanity we were reclaiming over this meal would one day be the standard, not the exception. As the final embers of the grills began to fade and the bottles were emptied, a quiet resolve would settle over the group. We knew that tomorrow the gates would open again, the snow would fall, or the heat would rise, and we would return to being the ghosts of the mountains. But we were going back with a renewed spirit. We were no longer just the boys who had graduated in 2008. We were the men who had looked into the void and decided to laugh over a plate of samgyeopsal. This feast was the bridge between our civilian past and our creative future, the moment I realized that if I could survive this, I could build anything, even a YouTube channel called Game Talk or a new life in Thailand. The tiger was well fed, and though the mission continued, the heart was finally at rest. The morning of my discharge didn't feel like the cinematic triumph I had imagined for 700 days. In the 15th Infantry Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, mornings usually began with the sharp, aggressive bite of the cold, or the humid weight of the summer air. But this day was different. The air felt lighter, as if the mountains themselves were finally exhaling after holding their breath for 2 years. As I adjusted my beret for the last time in the cracked barracks mirror, the sergeant's stripes on my shoulders felt both incredibly heavy and strangely hollow. I was no longer the soldier who belonged to this land. I was a man about to be returned to a world I had almost forgotten. The farewell in the garrison was a whirlwind of raw emotion and unspoken gratitude. In the military, goodbye is a word that carries a different weight. My unit members, the men who had shoveled white trash beside me in -30 degrees and shared the suffocating stench of the Yugyok tents, gathered around me. There were no formal speeches, just the firm, lingering handshakes and the hengarai, the tradition of tossing the departing soldier into the air. As I was thrown toward the K-Or-Wan sky, I looked down at their faces, the young, weary tigers I was leaving behind. I felt a sharp pang of guilt. I was going back to the lights of Seoul while they remained here, standing guard over the silent, dangerous ridgelines of the DMZ. I gripped their hands and told them to stay healthy, to survive the winter, and to never let the silence of the border break their spirits. "Don't get hurt," I whispered, a final order from a sergeant who was now just a friend. As I walked toward the heavy iron gate of the garrison, the same gate that had once felt like the jaws of a beast, a flood of memories hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I remembered the day I first arrived, a terrified recruit with a shaved head and eyes filled with tears I couldn't hide. I remembered crying quietly into my thin pillow during that first week of boot camp, overwhelmed by the loss of my identity and the crushing weight of the unknown. I thought of the times during those brutal mountain marches when the physical agony became so absolute that I had contemplated the unthinkable faking an injury or an illness just to have a single hour of rest. I remembered the shame of that thought, the desire to just give up and be sick so the pain would stop. But I had looked at the man in front of me, seen his own struggle, and kept moving. Every tear, every moment of weakness, and every desperate prayer for an end to the training had been the hammer and anvil that made me who I was standing at that gate today. The bus ride from Cheorwan to Seoul was a journey through time as much as space. As the rugged gray mountains of Gangwon province slowly gave way to the expanding concrete and neon of the city, my mind was a chaotic mix of relief and anxiety. I watched the civilians on the bus, people who had spent the last 2 years moving through life at a normal pace, and I felt like an alien returning from another planet. They didn't know about the ghost mines or the smell of a bunker during a national crisis. They didn't know the taste of a snow-chilled soda in a place with no PX. I looked at my reflection in the window, seeing the hard lines of my face and the steady, watchful gaze of a recon soldier, and I realized that I was taking the tiger back to the city with me. By the time the skyline of Seoul appeared on the horizon, the tall buildings of Gangnam and the familiar sprawl of the urban landscape, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The graduation in 2008 had been the end of my childhood, but this discharge from the 15th Division was the beginning of my true life. The 1.2 million KRWPC I had dreamed of in the dark was no longer just a luxury. It was the mission. I was going home to build that machine, to start Game Talk, and to tell the stories of the border and the human spirit to the world. I had survived the white abyss and the humid hell, and now the asphalt of Seoul felt like a new battlefield where I could finally win on my own terms. Stepping off the bus in the heart of the city, the noise and the heat of the crowds were overwhelming, but I didn't flinch. I took a deep breath of the city air, which tasted of exhaust and opportunity, and I started walking toward home. I was a civilian again, but I would always be a soldier of the reconnaissance battalion. The gate had closed. The mountain had let me go, and the mission, my mission, was finally beginning. I was home, and I was ready to build my future, one frame, one story, and one dream at a time. Part 9, the solo creator's mission from the DMZ to the digital world. 약 9,000 작업. The transition from the jagged ridge lines of Cheorwan to the glowing screens of a digital studio wasn't just a change of scenery, it was the start of a new solo mission. People often ask me how I survived those frozen nights in the reconnaissance battalion, and my answer is always the same: by finding the stories that kept my spirit alive. In the silence of the DMZ, I realized that every human being is fighting a battle, and every battle deserves to be told. This realization became the foundation for my current path as a solo entrepreneur and a creator. I chose to set up my base of operations in Gimpo, utilizing the benefits for young entrepreneurs to build a foundation for my creative business. But to me, being a one in Sayobga is about more than just tax registrations or legal documents. It is about the recon mentality, the same obsessive attention to detail I used on the border, now applied to the art of storytelling. When I analyze the narrative structure of a video or a game, the rising action, the climax, and the falling action, I am conducting a scouting mission. I am looking for the human soul hidden within the pixels, the same grit and resilience I saw in my comrades during the 2010 crisis. My creative mission is to take existing stories and reinterpret them through my own unique lens. Whether it is the deep lore of a fantasy world or the real-life struggles of individuals who have overcome physical limitations, I seek to uncover the universal truths that connect us all. I don't just want to create content. I want to create a bridge between my experiences in the frozen valleys and the digital battlefield of the present. The 1.2 million KRWPC I once dreamed of in a cold bunker is no longer a fantasy. It is the weapon I use to build my future. As a solo creator, the road is often lonely, and the winter of uncertainty can feel just as cold as a night in Cheorwan. But I have learned that the mind is the strongest weapon we possess. I am no longer guarding a border with a K2 rifle, but I am guarding the power of authentic storytelling with a keyboard and a mouse. To anyone out there facing their own silent DMZ or starting their own solo journey, remember this. The Forge of Hardship is only meant to make you unbreakable. The mission continues, and this time the story is mine to tell. Thank you so much for walking this long journey with me today. Through this process, I've realized that this space has become something much more than just a channel to me. From this point forward, I've decided to use this platform to record my personal diary. I want to document my growth as a solo entrepreneur in Gimpo and the everyday challenges I face as a creator. I'll be bringing the same grit and persistence I learned in the reconnaissance battalion to every single entry. I would be truly honored if you continued to stay by my side as I turn these new pages. I'll see you in the next entry of my diary.